3 decades, 30 years, building one of the strangest and most unforgettable figures in American sports history. And there was never a moment when it truly collapsed completely. Because with Dennis Rodman, everything always seemed to be on the verge of falling apart. There is a rare type of legend who does not just win on the court. They make the whole world believe that chaos can also have meaning, that you do not need to be perfect to become great, that even the most lost person can still find their place. Dennis Rodman once was that person, living proof that a boy who was abandoned, who grew up in silence and deprivation, could still step into the biggest arenas on the planet and become an irreplaceable factor in the greatest victories. He did not score many points. He did not need the spotlight. But he did the things no one else wanted to do. And by doing that, he forced the whole world to see him. But what happens when the man the whole world calls crazy is actually someone who is just trying to survive? What happens when the chaos is not a choice, but the only way he knows how to exist? How does a child who grew up with no one coming back for him, no one teaching him how to be loved, become one of the biggest icons in global sports, and still cannot hold on to himself when the lights go out? What is really happening behind the dyed hair? The shocking behaviors, the moments that make the whole world both laugh and feel confused? And why, after all the titles, the victories, and the years at the peak, does Dennis Rodman's image today make people no longer feel excited, but instead leave a feeling that is hard to name, a heaviness, as if we are looking at a man who never really had the chance to find peace before the titles, before the lights, before everything that made him a legend? This story has to go back to the beginning, to a boy the world had never seen. A boy who learned very early that, if you cannot be loved, you have to find another way to survive, and sometimes that way is to become a person no one can understand. If this story makes you think differently about what you once saw, please hit subscribe so you do not miss the next parts. That story began in a place with no lights, no applause, no one waiting to call Dennis Rodman's name. But only a child who grew up in a silence so long it became normal, a silence where the father, the one who should have been the first anchor, had left and never came back, without explanation, without apology, without even one glance back, leaving behind not just a family with a void, but an emptiness that nothing could fill. And for a child, that absence was never simply, "he left," but always turned into a question that repeated in his head, day after day. Why did he not come back? Why did he not choose to stay? And deeper still, why did he not choose me? That was the kind of question with no answers soothing enough, and there was no one there to help him understand that the fault was not in him. Because, when you are too small to understand the world, you will always believe that everything that happens is related to you. That maybe you were not good enough, not worthy enough to be kept, and from that moment, a dangerous belief began to form, quietly but persistently, that love is something that can disappear at any time, that people can leave without reason, and that you have no right to demand they stay. There was no man in the house to show him how to become a man, no one to teach him how to control emotions, how to face pain, how to understand that weakness is not something to be ashamed of. All he had was absence. And sometimes absence is the harshest teacher, because it does not teach you anything specific. It only leaves voids that you have to fill yourself in the way you understand. And most of the time, that way is not the right way. His mother was still there, but her presence was not the warmth people usually imagine when talking about family. She was a strong, strict woman, trying to keep everything from falling apart in a world that was already too harsh. And in that effort, she did not have much room for gentleness, not many moments to tell her son that he was good enough, that he was loved, that he did not need to do anything to deserve it. Love, if it existed, was shown through responsibility, through discipline, through existing one more day, but for a child, that is never enough. Because children do not understand responsibility. They only understand feeling. And the feeling Dennis carried through those years was something very hard to name. Not completely sadness, not completely anger, but a prolonged emptiness, as if a part of him had been taken away very early and was never returned. He grew up without really feeling he belonged anywhere. Not at home, not at school, not in any relationship. And when you do not feel you belong, you begin to learn how to exist without needing anyone else. You create your own world, where you do not need to expect anything from others, only to be disappointed. But the price of that is you also do not know how to accept it. When real love appears, because no one ever taught you what it looks like, no one ever gave you enough experience for you to believe it could stay. And so, instead of seeking connection, you begin to learn how to endure, how to keep everything inside, how to not need anyone, at least on the surface, but deep down, the need to be seen, to be chosen, to be kept still remains. It does not disappear, only buried. And that very contradiction between not needing anyone and craving to be needed would follow him throughout his life, shaping the way he loved, the way he reacted, the way he self-destructed the good things when they came too close, because for a child no one came back for. Hope is always the most dangerous thing, and sometimes destroying it before it has the chance to disappear feels much safer. That feeling did not disappear when he grew up. It only changed shape, became quieter, harder to recognize, but also sank deeper into the way Dennis Rodman saw himself, because throughout his teenage years, he was not the child others noticed, not the one called on in class, not the one teachers or friends remembered when talking about someone with potential. He was simply there, existing but not really present, a quiet shadow passing among people who had clearer goals, more confidence, and seemed to know where they were going, while he did not. At home, the comparison made that feeling even clearer. When his sisters achieved success in sports, were noticed, were recognized, became the rare pride in a family already under too much pressure. And in that context, Rodman was not only the one forgotten by his father, but also the one who could not catch up to the standards his family unintentionally set. He was not as fast as them, not as good as them, had nothing to make others stop and look at him for more than a second, and that comparison, even if not always spoken, still existed in every glance, every question, every silence, making him gradually believe that maybe he really was inferior, that maybe being left behind was not accidental, but obvious. When you hear long enough that you are not special, you will begin to live as if that is the truth. And Rodman did exactly that. He did not dream big, did not set goals, did not try to become someone. Because deep inside, he had accepted that he was not the kind of person the world would notice. And so, those years passed in a series of simple labor jobs, days repeating so much that today and tomorrow could not be distinguished. Working as a security guard, working at the airport, doing whatever could help him survive one more day. But none of those jobs gave him the feeling that he was moving forward. No direction, no plan, only drifting. And that drifting was not loud, not dramatic, it was quiet. But that was exactly why it was dangerous. Because you can live in that state for a very long time without realizing you are gradually disappearing from your own life. You wake up, work, come back, and repeat. And in that whole process, there is no moment that makes you feel you are truly important, truly needed, truly valuable. And that is when the most dangerous belief begins to form. Not the belief that the world is unfair, but the belief that maybe you are not worthy of anything better. That maybe this life is simply like that for you. And the scariest thing is when you start to believe that, you also stop trying to change it. Rodman did not rebel at that time, did not draw attention, did not try to break out. He just existed. And that passive existence was the most painful thing, because it did not give you the chance to fail or succeed. It only kept you in a place where you could not go anywhere. A place where you were not bad enough to hit bottom and be forced to change, but also not good enough to be pulled up. And in that suspended emptiness, he gradually lost the ability to see his own value, not because he had no value, but because no one had ever shown him that. No one had ever stopped long enough to say that he could become something else. And when no one believes in you, you will learn not to believe in yourself. And once that belief is gone, every opportunity, even if it appears, becomes invisible, just like the way he had always felt about himself. Invisible, unimportant, and easy to be left behind. And then, when everything seemed to have been decided, when Dennis Rodman's life was drifting in a silence so deep it was almost disappearing, something happened that no one, not even he himself, could have predicted. His body began to change. Not in a slow way, not in a way people could prepare for, but in the sudden, almost violent transformation when his height shot up in a short period of time. From a short, unknown young man, he suddenly became someone who could make others turn their heads just because of his build. And in that moment, the world gave him for the first time something he had never had before, an opportunity. But that opportunity did not come with preparation, did not come with psychological foundation, did not come with any guidance on how to hold on to it, because you can change your body in a few months, but you cannot heal a childhood in that same amount of time. And so, when the door to basketball opened, he stepped in not with the confidence of someone who knew he deserved it, but with the confusion of someone who did not understand why he was even there. He started playing basketball late, very late compared to others, with no technical foundation, no competition experience, no one behind him to guide every step. All he had was a new body and an old need, the need to be seen, to be recognized, to prove that he was not invisible like he had always believed. And that very lack shaped the way he played basketball. He did not play to look good, did not play to shine in the usual way. He played like a man trying to hold on to his place, as if every rebound battle was a fight to prove he deserved to stay, that this time he would not be abandoned again. But even when opportunities began to appear, even when he gradually stepped into a more professional basketball environment, inside he did not change. The same self-doubt was still there, the same fear that all of this could disappear at any moment, that if he did not do enough, if he did not try harder than others, he would go back to where he had once stood, where no one saw him, where no one remembered him. And that was why basketball was not just a sport for Rodman. It became the only thing keeping him here, the only thing giving him a reason to keep going. A temporary structure in a life that had no structure. Every time he stepped onto the court, he was not just playing a game. He was trying to keep himself from falling back into that emptiness. And the sad thing is that even though on the outside everything seemed to be changing, even though he began to make progress he had never imagined before, inside, he was still that same child, still carrying all the unhealed wounds, still not knowing how to believe that good things could last. And so, even when life gave him a chance to start over, he did not step into it with peace, but with a constant fear, a feeling that everything happening was only temporary, that at any moment it could all disappear, and this time there might not be a second chance. And then, when the door he had never dared to think about finally opened, when Dennis Rodman stepped into the NBA, it was not the glorious moment people usually imagine. There were no lights shining directly on him, no welcome for a new star, no one waiting for him to change the game with scoring plays, because from the beginning, he was not the type of player people built a team around. He was not the center, not the hero, not the name appearing in newspaper headlines. He was just another name on the list, a tall body with an empty past and a future no one was sure about. And in that environment, where everyone was talented and had their own place, Rodman had to face a truth he had already known too well before, that if he did not find a way to become important, he would disappear again, just like he had disappeared throughout his childhood. And so, he did not choose the path others chose. He did not try to become the highest scorer, did not try to become the brightest star, because he understood very clearly one thing: in that position, he would never win. Instead, he took a different path, a path very few people wanted to take. He dove into the battles others avoided. He jumped into situations where his body took constant hits. He chased every loose ball as if it was the only thing keeping him on the court. And little by little, he began to build his value not through standout plays, but through sacrifice, through accepting to do the things no one else wanted to do. And it was in that process that a dangerous connection began to form, a connection he did not even realize, that his value was tied to how much he could endure, that the more he threw himself into pain, the more necessary he became, the more recognized he became, the more he was kept. And for a person who had grown up with the fear of abandonment, that was a lesson both powerful and cruel, because it taught him that to be allowed to stay, he had to pay a price, and that price was his body, his energy, his own safety. He did not play basketball in a beautiful way. He played like a man fighting to survive. Every play was not just a play, but an affirmation that he deserved to be here, that this time he would not be left behind. And when those efforts began to be recognized, when coaches began to trust him, when teammates began to rely on him in the hardest moments, that was not liberation. It was a reinforced cycle, because now he knew for sure that the only way to be seen was to keep pushing himself to the limit, to keep enduring more, to keep doing the things others could not or would not do. And the sad thing is that even though he was moving forward, even though he was becoming an important part of a professional team, inside he did not feel safer, did not feel more complete. On the contrary, the pressure became even greater because now he had something to lose. And for a person who had lost everything very early, the fear of losing it again was always bigger than any joy success could bring. And so, instead of enjoying what he had achieved, he kept running, kept throwing himself into every play as if stopping would make everything disappear. And perhaps, on some level, he believed that was true. And then, what had once seemed impossible actually happened, when Dennis Rodman not only found his place in the NBA, but also became part of one of the most feared teams of that era, the Detroit Pistons, a collective built on iron discipline, toughness, and a spirit that never backed down. And in that environment, Rodman finally found something he had never had before: a clear structure, a system where everyone had a role, where he did not need to wonder who he was, because the team answered for him. He was the one who did the things no one else wanted to do, the one willing to sacrifice, the one who accepted the hits, the one who did not need the spotlight but could not be missed in the most important moments. And it was in that structure that he began to develop, began to become important, began to become an irreplaceable part of the winning machine. And when the Pistons won the NBA championship, not once but back-to-back, that should have been the moment when everything was confirmed, that all he had been through, all he had endured, had finally led to a deserving result. But for Rodman, that feeling was never complete, because inside him there was still a small but persistent voice, a voice saying that all of this could disappear at any moment, that he did not really belong here, that this success felt more like something borrowed temporarily than something he truly deserved. And because of that, instead of feeling more solid, he clung even tighter to the system that had kept him stable. He depended on the team's discipline, on the rhythm of practice, on the clear rules the Pistons imposed, because those were the only things that kept him from facing the emptiness inside himself. And in that whole system, one person became especially important: the coach, who was not only the one directing tactics but also a role model, a mental anchor that Rodman had never had in his life, a man who could set limits, who could control him, who could keep him in his right place. And in a way, that was the first time he felt someone truly saw him, not because he was shocking, Not because he was different, but because he had value in a larger structure, and that made him hold on to it like something he could not lose. But the problem was that when your value depends entirely on a system, when your feeling of stability depends entirely on someone else, you are not truly standing firm. You are only being held in place. And Rodman, even at the peak of his career, still could not escape that feeling. He did not look at the titles and see affirmation. He looked at them and saw pressure, saw the fear that he had to keep maintaining, had to keep sacrificing, had to keep enduring, or else everything would collapse. And so, his success did not bring liberation. It only changed the form of the fear, from the fear of having nothing to the fear of losing everything. And in both cases, he was still trapped, still could not truly rest, still could not believe that what he had was lasting. And the saddest thing is that even when he stood at the peak of his career, even when he was part of a championship team, he still could not look at himself and say that he deserved all of it, because no one had ever taught him how to believe that from the beginning. But then, just like everything in Dennis Rodman's life, that stability didn't last. The system that had once kept him steady started to change. The people who had created that structure left one by one, and most importantly, the person who had served as a mental anchor, the one who had invisibly kept him within bounds, was no longer there. And for many people, that was just a change in the team, a normal transition period in professional sports. But for Rodman, it was a much deeper break, because he had never really stood on his own. He only stood steady when someone was holding him in place, and when that hand let go, he didn't know what to do next. There was no one to set boundaries, no one to tell him what was enough and what was over the limit, and what happened after that was not a sudden collapse, but a slow slide, gradual but unstoppable. The discipline that had once helped him survive started to disappear. The habits that kept him stable were gradually replaced by impulsiveness, and the emotions he had suppressed for so long began to surface. No longer controlled, no longer shaped, they emerged in chaos, sometimes as anger, sometimes as anxiousness, sometimes as a sadness with no clear source. And the scariest part was that he didn't know how to name them, didn't know how to handle them, because no one had ever taught him that. And when you don't understand your own emotions, you start reacting in ways that even you don't recognize. Impulsive actions, incomprehensible decisions, moments where outsiders only see a person losing control. But inside, it was a person trying to find the balance he had never truly possessed. The loneliness that had always existed in him now was no longer covered by the rhythm of team life, no longer distracted by clear goals. It became clearer, heavier, as if all the voids from the past came rushing back at once. And this time, there was nothing to hide them. No noise of victory, no structure of discipline, no one to hold on to, only him and himself. And for a person who had never learned how to be alone without feeling lost, that was a state that was almost unbearable. His life began to lose direction, with no clear orbit anymore, no specific destination, just days passing with decisions that became increasingly hard to control. And even though on the outside he was still an NBA player, still part of the world of professional sports, inside he had begun to drift away from himself, little by little, as if he was standing on a slope he didn't notice until he had slid too far to turn back. And the most painful thing was not that he was losing control, but that there was no one there to hold him back when it happened. And then, after all those slides that no one really saw, after the days when emotions were no longer controlled and the nights when silence became heavier than any noise, that moment finally came. A moment where, for Dennis Rodman, everything seemed to stop completely, not because he found peace, but because he no longer saw a reason to continue. In 1993, with no lights, no audience, no team, just a car, a gun, and a person at the lowest point of himself. A person who had been through so much without ever truly understanding it, who had tried to survive in every way he knew, but in the end still came back to the same familiar feeling. The feeling that everything he did was still not enough to fill the emptiness inside. And in that moment, he was not an NBA athlete, not a champion, not an icon. He was just a man sitting alone, facing himself, and not recognizing the person looking back. The feeling of emptiness was no longer a fleeting state. It became an all-encompassing reality, as if everything he had ever achieved, every effort, every pain, led to no meaning at all, as if it was all just a series of actions with no connection. And when you stay in that state long enough, the question is no longer, why do I feel this way? But is it worth continuing? And that is the most dangerous question a person can face, because it doesn't demand a logical answer. It only needs one moment of weakness, one moment when you no longer have the strength to resist. And in that car, with the gun in his hand, Rodman had come very close to that moment, not because he wanted to die in the way people usually understand, but because he wanted to end the person he was being, and the feeling of emptiness, and the lost feeling, end a life he had never truly understood. It was not a well-thought-out decision, but the result of a long process of accumulation, of years that no one saw, of emotions that had never been resolved, of a child who grew up without being taught how to face himself. And in that moment, everything converged, with no distinction between past and present, no boundary between the person he had been and the person he did not want to become. There was only one choice, one decision that could end it all. But then, in a way that even he later found hard to explain, he didn't pull the trigger. He didn't end his life that night. But that didn't mean everything went back to normal, because the truth is, after that night, his old self was no longer there. He didn't step out of the car as a healed person. He stepped out as someone who had crossed a boundary that not everyone comes back from. And instead of trying to go back to how things were before, he chose a different path, a more extreme path, louder, harder to understand, as if he couldn't become a normal person. He would become something no one could define, a version of himself that no one, not even him, could fully control. And it was from that moment that the Dennis Rodman the world knew later began to take shape. Not from confidence, not from freedom, but from a desperate decision. A decision to keep living, but no longer as the person he had been before. After that night, when the line between continuing to live and letting go had been blurred, Dennis Rodman did not return as a better version of himself. He did not seek peace. He did not try to fix what had been broken, but instead, he began to completely destroy the old person he once was, as if he could not endure that feeling of emptiness one more time. Then the only way was to never return to the person who had once felt that way. And the first change the world saw was not on the inside, but on the outside. His hair began to be dyed in colors that no one before had thought a professional athlete would dare to wear. His body began to be covered with tattoos, marks not only of aesthetics but also of a process of redefining himself. Clothes, the way he dressed, the way he appeared in public, everything changed in a direction no one could predict, no one could control. And in the eyes of many people, that was rebellion. Eccentricity, a person trying to get attention at all costs. But what they didn't see was that all of that was not to attract attention, but to create a layer of protection, a shell thick enough so that no one could touch the real part inside. Because if no one understood you, they couldn't hurt you either. And if you became too different, too unpredictable, too strange, you would no longer have to face anyone's expectations. Rodman no longer tried to be accepted in the way he had before. He no longer tried to fit into any image. He went in the completely opposite direction, becoming something no one could put into a framework. And in that process, the chaos was no longer something he tried to control. It became part of his identity, part of the way he existed in the world. Every shocking action, every appearance that surprised others, was not random, but a way to keep distance, to make sure no one got too close. No one saw the real person he had tried to bury after that night. And the irony is, the more different he became, the more attention he got. The media started following his every move. The public started getting drawn into the image of an athlete unlike anyone else, a person who was both talented and hard to understand, both attractive and controversial. And little by little, a new image was built, not by him, but by the way the world saw him. An image of madness, of rebellion, of a person who didn't care about any norms. But the problem was, that image was not entirely the truth. It was only the surface of a much deeper story. A story that very few people tried to understand, because it was easier to look at him and laugh, easier to call him weird than to ask why he had become that way. And precisely because of that, as the attention increased, the misunderstanding increased too. Rodman became an icon, but not an icon of victory or discipline, but an icon of difference, of breaking rules. And while the world continued to observe him from the outside, very few people realized that everything they were seeing was just a shell created not to impress, but to survive. And as time went on, the line between the real person and that image became increasingly blurred, to the point where even he himself might no longer be able to distinguish which was truly himself, and which was the version he had created to avoid facing himself. And then, when that new image had been shaped, when the world began to look at Dennis Rodman as a phenomenon rather than a person, he stepped into another chapter in his career, a chapter that on the surface looked like the peak, when he joined the Chicago Bulls, the team that possessed one of the most perfect structures in history, where there was Michael Jordan, there was Scottie Pippen, and there was a system that operated almost without flaws. And in that context, Rodman once again found a place where he could exist, not as a star in the traditional sense, but as an irreplaceable piece, the one who did the things no one else on the team could or wanted to do, the one willing to dive into every play, every collision, every moment where victory was decided not by glamour, but by endurance and sacrifice. And in the Bulls uniform, he reached a height that very few people could touch. 3 consecutive championships, games where his name did not always appear on the scoreboard, but was always present in the most important moments. And on the court, there was one undeniable thing. Rodman was almost perfect, not in the sense of beauty, but in the sense of precision, of discipline, of understanding his role clearly and executing it to an extreme degree. He knew where he had to be, what he had to do, how much he had to sacrifice, and within the boundaries of the basketball court, he controlled himself in a way he had never been able to do in life. But that very contrast made everything clearer, because when the game ended, when the lights went out, when there was no longer any system keeping him in frame, the person he had tried to hide came back, stronger, more chaotic, and with nothing left to control it, his life off the court did not follow any discipline. The sleepless nights, the long parties, the behaviors that left others confused or worried, all happened in parallel with the perfection he showed on the court. And for many people, that was hard to understand. How could one person be so disciplined in one space and completely out of control in another? But for Rodman, it was not 2 different people, but 2 sides of the same reality. The basketball court was the only place where he knew who he had to be, the only place where everything had rules, had boundaries, had clear goals, while off the court, none of that existed. There was no one to tell him when it was enough, no structure to hold on to, no system to keep him in place. And so he drifted from one night to the next, from one decision to another, as if he was trying to compensate for all the emotions he had to suppress when he stepped onto the court. And the saddest part was that even though he achieved the highest level of success, even though he was recognized, even though he stood at the peak of the basketball world, he still could not find the peace that people usually associate with those things. Because peace does not come from titles. does not come from victories. It comes from within. And that was exactly the place where he had never truly been healed. And so every championship, every victory, every moment of glory was just a temporary cover over a void that was still there, unchanged, not disappearing, and perhaps deep down he knew that no matter how many times he won, no matter how important he became, there was still a part of him that no victory could reach. And then, when the arena lights were no longer enough to hide the voids inside, when the victories no longer brought the same sense of fulfillment as before, Dennis Rodman began to search for something he had never truly had, something that could not be measured by titles or statistics, something he had lacked from very early on but did not know how to name. That was love, the feeling of being stayed with, of being chosen, of being kept without having to fight to earn it. But the problem was, you could not build something you had never learned how to keep, and so every relationship of his started with a very real, very strong hope, as if this time would be different, as if this time he would find what he had missed throughout his life. But precisely because of that, the pressure in those relationships became much heavier, because for Rodman love was not just affection. It was salvation. It was the answer to everything he did not understand about himself. And when you put too many expectations on something, you also unintentionally make it more fragile. His marriages, from Carmen Electra to the other relationships, were not lacking in passion, not lacking in emotion, but they lacked the most important thing: stability, patience, and a foundation solid enough to withstand the difficult times. Because whenever there was any sign of distance, any moment that made him feel he might be abandoned once again, his reaction was not to wait or to talk, but to control, to act impulsively, to do things that made everything more tense. And in those moments, the past was no longer the past. It came back as a present reality, as if he was that child again, standing there watching someone leave without being able to do anything to stop it. And instead of facing that fear, he tried to run from it, sometimes by pushing others away before they had the chance to leave, sometimes by destroying the very relationship he was trying to keep. Because, for a person who was used to loss, ending everything with his own hands felt easier than waiting for it to collapse, and that created a loop he could not escape. The more he craved love, the more he acted in ways that made that love unable to exist. The more he wanted to keep someone, the more he made them leave faster, and each time, like that, the old belief was reinforced once again, that love does not stay, that people always leave, that he could not keep anything for long. And in that loop, he not only lost those relationships, but also gradually lost the ability to believe that a relationship could be different, that there was another way to love without having to control, without having to be afraid, without having to self-destruct. And so, no matter who he was with, no matter how hard he tried, the ending always seemed the same. Not because he did not want to love, but because he had never been taught how to love without losing himself. And in each breakup, not only was a relationship ending, but a part of him was pulled back to the original feeling, the feeling of a child that no one came back for. And when the relationships fell apart one after another, when the efforts to find connection did not lead to what he expected, Dennis Rodman gradually became a person the world no longer looked at as an individual, but as a phenomenon, something to observe, to gossip about, to consume, because at that point his image was different enough to draw every eye, and the media quickly realized that he was not just an athlete, he was a story, an endless source of content, a person whose every appearance brought something unexpected, something that could become a headline. And so, step by step, the image he had created to protect himself began to be exploited, exaggerated, defined in ways he no longer controlled. The multicolored hair, the outfits unlike anyone else's, the behaviors that went beyond norms, all became elements the media used to build a version of Rodman that was easier for the public to understand, a version they could label with simple words like crazy, weird, unusual. And in that process, the real person behind gradually disappeared, not because he no longer existed, but because no one was looking for him anymore. Because it was much easier to look at him as a shocking icon, an entertainment figure, than to face the complex truth that behind all of that was a person trying to survive. And when you are looked at as a phenomenon for too long, you also start living as a phenomenon, not because you want to, but because that is the only way the world responds to you. Rodman appeared on television shows at events, in spaces where his role was no longer that of an athlete, but of someone who drew attention, someone who brought surprise, and each time like that the gap between the real person and the image the public saw grew a little larger, until that boundary almost disappeared. And the most painful thing was that in all that attention, in all those eyes focused on him, very few people actually saw him, not the hair, not the behavior, not the shocking stories, but the person standing behind all of that, a person who still carried questions that had never had answers, who still carried the feeling of abandonment from very early on, who still did not know how to exist without having to turn himself into something different. And so fame, the thing many people believe will connect you with the world, instead became the thing that isolated him more than ever, because when people think they know you, they stop trying to understand you, and then you can stand in the middle of millions of eyes and still be completely alone. And then, in a life where familiar places gradually became strange, when even fame no longer brought a sense of belonging, Dennis Rodman began to search for meaning in places no one thought he would go. The trips to North Korea, the meetings with Kim Jong-un, not as part of a clear plan, not as a carefully calculated strategy, but like another effort to find a role, a reason to feel he was still important, still able to contribute, still able to be part of something bigger than himself. Because when you cannot find meaning in familiar places, you start looking for it in the strangest places. And in those trips, Rodman did not just carry the image of a former NBA player. He carried his entire past, carried the need to be recognized, to be needed, and in some moment perhaps he believed he had found it. That he was no longer the one left behind, but the one who could connect worlds. Others could not, but the outside world did not see it the way he did. The media and the public did not see a person trying to find meaning. They saw a controversial figure, a person stepping into sensitive areas they did not understand or accept, and the criticism quickly appeared, not lightly but harshly, directly, questioning his motives, his sanity, everything he was doing. And once again, Rodman stood between two worlds, one side what he felt, one side how the world reacted, and that gap did not make him stronger. It only made the pressure greater, because when you believe you are doing the right thing but the whole world says you are wrong, the loneliness is not just an emotion, it becomes a burden, something you have to carry every day, every time you appear in public, every time you are questioned. Every time you have to explain things that even you cannot fully express, and in those moments, it was not hard to see something familiar return. The feeling that he was still standing alone, still trying to prove something no one really wanted to hear, still searching for a place where he could belong without having to change. But that place seemed not to exist, not in basketball, not in family, not in fame, and not in those faraway trips. And the most painful thing was not that he was misunderstood, but that he kept searching, kept believing that somewhere there was a role for him, a place where he did not have to fight to stay. And that very belief, no matter how fragile, was still what kept him moving forward, even when every step took him into a land where no one was really there to welcome him. And when time continued to move forward, when the trips, the noise, the controversies gradually calmed down, what remained was not a clear ending, but a prolonged state, a reality where, when looking at Dennis Rodman today, people no longer saw the performative chaos like before, but saw something heavier, slower, harder to name, a feeling that his body could no longer keep up with the person he had once tried to become, that the years of throwing himself into collisions, the uncalculated sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the periods of pushing himself to the limit, all had left marks, not always obvious, not always visible to the naked eye, but enough to make every appearance of his carry a hard-to-hide worry, steps that were no longer as steady as before, eyes that no longer held the sharpness that once made opponents cautious, and in those moments, people began to realize that time does not only take away physical strength, it also reveals what was previously hidden by speed, by energy, by the busyness of a life always in motion. His public appearances now no longer brought a sense of surprise or excitement, but often came with silent questions whether he was okay, where he was in his own life. And what made those questions heavy was not a specific event, but the way they repeated, the way each appearance reinforced the feeling that something was unstable, that there was a fatigue accumulating with no place to release, and unlike before, when he was still in a system, when there was still a team, coaches, teammates, people who whether directly or indirectly still kept him within a certain frame, now those things were no longer there. No more training schedules forcing him to wake up every day. No more games forcing him to keep his body in the best condition. No clear structure to hold on to. And for a person who had once relied on that structure to exist, this absence was not just a change, it was a void that was not easy to fill. And in that void, everything became more unstable. Not always in the noisy way like before, but in a quieter way. Harder to notice, but also harder to control. The signs of fatigue were not only in the body, but also in the way he appeared, the way he reacted, the way he talked about himself, as if the energy that had once helped him overcome everything was now no longer enough to keep everything balanced. And the sad thing is, even though he is still there, still continues to appear, still continues to live, the feeling he brings is no longer that of a person fighting to survive, but of a person who has fought for too long, too much, to the point where there is not much left to rely on, not many places to return to, and in all of that, what makes it hardest for people to face is not the change, but the realization that perhaps even now, even after everything he has been through, he is still on the same journey he started a very long time ago, a journey of searching for stability, for belonging, a place where he can stop without feeling like he is losing something. But up to this point, that place has still not appeared, and so his life continues, not like a completed story, but like a chain of days following one another, where each day is an effort to keep himself from sliding too far, to keep moving forward, even when it is not always clear where he is going. And that more than anything else makes the image of Dennis Rodman today hard to look at. Not because he has failed, but because he is still continuing, while the things that once kept him steady are no longer there. And if one has to look back at the entire journey, from a child no one came back for, to a person the whole world knows but still does not truly understand, then perhaps the most truthful thing about Dennis Rodman does not lie in the titles, does not lie in the shocking moments, but in a simple yet heavy truth that this is a life that was never built on a solid foundation, with no safety from the start, no sense of belonging to hold on to, no basic things that many people take for granted. And when you start from a place like that, everything you achieve afterward, no matter how great, always carries a fragility, a feeling that it could disappear at any time. And for Rodman, that never really left him. Not when he stood at the peak of the NBA, not when he became a global icon, and not even now when everything has calmed down, because stability was not something he lost, but something he had never truly had. He did not go through a single collapse. There was no clear moment when everything changed completely, but rather a continuous series of fluctuations, where success and pain always existed side by side, where every step forward came with a fear, where every victory was never enough to erase the feeling of emptiness, and that very coexistence defined his entire life, not as a story of glory nor as a complete tragedy, but as a prolonged journey of trying to survive while never truly learning how to live in peace. And in all of that, the legacy he leaves is not just numbers, not just trophies, but something much harder to measure. An image of sacrifice to the extreme, of accepting to do the things no one else wanted to do in order to keep himself in the game, of daring to be different even when it made the whole world turn its back. And even if it is not always in a way that people can easily admire, it is still a form of strength, a very unique form of resilience, because not everyone can go through so many years, so many incidents, so many times of losing direction, and still continue to stand up, still continue to appear, still continue to exist, even when there is no guarantee that tomorrow will be different. And perhaps that is exactly what makes his story unforgettable. Not because he is perfect, but because he never was. Not because he won everything, but because he never stopped fighting, even when there was no clear ending. And in a world where people often only celebrate complete stories, journeys that go from hardship to success and end in peace, Dennis Rodman's story stands in a different place, a place with no clear ending, no complete resolution, only a person who continues to move forward, continues to exist, even if he may never have truly felt he has arrived where he needs to be. And that, in a way, does not make him smaller, but on the contrary, makes him one of the most real people the world has ever witnessed. A person whose life was never easy, and perhaps was never meant to be easy. The story of Dennis Rodman does not make people heartbroken because he failed, but because he never really had a foundation to succeed fully from the beginning. And when looking back at the details that have passed, from a child abandoned by his father, growing up in strictness, lacking affection, always feeling invisible and worthless, to a man who had to learn how to become important by enduring, throwing himself into disputes, collisions, sacrifices that no one wanted to make just to be recognized, we cannot help but feel a painful sympathy, because even when he stood at the peak with the Chicago Bulls, winning multiple championships, he still carried the fear of abandonment, still did not believe he was worthy, and that showed clearly in the way he self-destructed his relationships, in the chaotic marriage with Carmen Electra, in the moment in 1993 when he sat alone in the car with a gun, and even in the way he created a crazy image to protect himself, only to be turned by the world itself into entertainment that no one truly understood. All those details are not isolated events, but a painful logical chain of a person who was never taught how to be loved, and therefore did not know how to keep love staying. And the biggest lesson here, especially for American society, where success is often celebrated as the measure of a person's value, is that success cannot replace healing, cannot fill the voids from childhood, and cannot guarantee a stable life if inside there is still unaddressed trauma. Because, as Rodman has shown, you can have it all from fame, money to glory. But if you do not have self-understanding and a solid emotional foundation, you can still feel lost in your own life. And so what is important is not becoming the best or the most famous, but learning to understand yourself, healing old wounds, and building real relationships before everything becomes too late. If the story of Dennis Rodman makes you look back at the true meaning of success and what is hidden behind the spotlight, please hit subscribe to join us in the next profound journeys. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore stories that the world thinks it has understood but actually never has.